Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome again to this webinar on Africa's policy towards the United States. As you are all aware, the United States is under a new administration, and the US has enjoyed warm relations with Africa over the decades. This webinar features leading experts who are going to brainstorm on how Africa can bring together a coherent policy towards the United States in the face of emerging challenges within the continent, as well as rapid changes across the world. To do this, we have a distinguished panel of experts who will be speaking to various issues around what African countries and African people should be thinking of and what actions they should take towards bringing together a coherent policy for engaging the United States. And this in itself is part of a series of activities which have been anchored by the African Center for the Study of the United States in Africa, as well as its partner organizations. And I really want to thank these various organizations: Wits University, the Institute for Global Dialogue, which is part of UNISA, as well as the Social Science Research Council, which is based in New York, of which I am a program director. And my name is Cyril Obi, and I really want to say that we look forward to a very, very robust discussion today and a set of engagements. And hopefully this will throw up ideas and bring together a lot of information and a lot of perspectives that will actually enrich the whole quest for a coherent set of engagements with the United States of America. To do this, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel of experts. We have Amini Kajunju. I would have said Amini does not need any introduction, but I would say that she is a distinguished personality, really, and it's really a pleasure to welcome Amini to this webinar. Amini is currently the Executive Director of the International University of Grand Bassam Foundation. The foundation is dedicated to empowering students and helping to procure the necessary financial, operational, and academic resources to make IUGB, located in La Côte d'Ivoire, a center of excellence for higher education in Africa. Kajunju joins the foundation from Africa Integras, where she served as Director of Strategic Partnerships, a New York-based firm which invests in the development of education infrastructure, including academic facilities, student hostels, and faculty housing at African universities, including the University of Ghana and Kenyatta University. Prior to her role with Africa Integras, Kajunju was a president and CEO of the Africa American Institute, AAI, in a New York-based nonprofit dedicated to strengthening human capacity in Africa. She is the first African to serve at the helm of the oldest nonprofit organization of its kind in the United States. And Amini has a lot of what I call gold medals in the spirit of the Olympics. There are so many that I will not go. I will just try to touch on a few of this. She was honored as Advocate of the Year at Applause Africa's African Diaspora Awards in 2013, and was named among Forbes 20 Young Power Women in Africa 2013. She was on the Economics of Innovation Council of the World Economic Forum between 2015 and 2016. In 2013, she was featured on CNN's Africa Voices and sits on the board of Education Congo and Junior Achievement Africa. I will just say a bit more about her credentials in terms of academic credentials. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in International Relations with an emphasis on economic development from Brigham Young University, and a master's in public administration with a concentration in finance and management from New York University's Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. Amini speaks French and has a basic understanding of Kiswahili and Lingala. A true African. You're welcome, Amini. I will then go on to introduce our next distinguished speaker, and that will be Asin Brice Bado. He is the Vice President for Academic Affairs at CERAP, Université Jésuite in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. He is a 2018 recipient of the SSRC's APN Individual Research Grant and a 2019 recipient of the SSRC's APM Book Manuscript Completion Fellowship. Prior to his time at CERAP, Bado was a Southern Voices Network scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. in 2015. He was also a visiting researcher at Yale University in the 2014-2015 academic year. Asin was the 2017 to 2018 Anna and Donald Waite Endowed Chair at Creighton University in Omaha. His research interests include democracy, ethnic pluralism, conflict analysis, forced migration, electoral processes in conflict-ridden societies, and foreign aid in Africa. He has published a lot in these various fields. In 2015, he edited a book titled Dynamique de guerre civile en Afrique, une approche holiste, which is published in Paris by La Matin. He is the author of Dignity Across Borders, Forced Migration and Christian Social Ethics, Denver, Colorado, and this was published in 2010. He obtained his PhD in political science from Laval University in Canada in 2016. Asin Brice Bado, you are welcome, and we look forward to listening to your presentation. Next, I have the pleasure and the honor to introduce Dr. Filani Ntembu. He's Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue, an independent foreign policy think tank based in Tshwane, which is Pretoria, South Africa. Prior to joining IGD, he pursued a joint doctoral program with the Graduate School of Global Politics, Freie University in Berlin, Germany, and the School of International Studies at Renmin University, Beijing, in China. The focus of his dissertation was on the rise of emerging powers as sources of development cooperation in Africa, for which he was awarded magna cum laude. He co-authored the Berlin Forum on Global Politics, a non-profit organization dedicated to the promotion of the public understanding of global politics. While completing his master's, he headed the academic development program for first-year students and was elected as the first independent candidate to the Student Representative Council. His recent publications include a single-authored book titled China and India's Development Cooperation in Africa, The Rise of Southern Powers, a co-edited book titled From MDGs to Sustainable Development Goals, The Travails of International Development, and a co-edited book, Africa and the World, Navigating Shifting Geopolitics, and a co-edited book, and another co-edited book titled Africa-China Cooperation, Towards an Africa Policy on China. So please, I also welcome another distinguished speaker, Filani. We also look forward to hearing from you. Then we have Dr. Charles Prente, who obtained his BA and MPhil degrees in African Studies from the University of Cape Coast and the University of Ghana, respectively. He also pursued 2 years of interdisciplinary work in social studies at the Makerere Institute of Social Research, or otherwise called MISA, and he successfully defended his doctoral thesis on Pentecostalism and chieftaincy at the Faculty of Divinity, University of Cambridge in February 2021. His research interests include chieftaincy, religions, gender, and youth popular culture. He has published academic articles in these areas. Charles, you are welcome, and we look forward also to listening to you. And we have with us Dr. Bob Wickessa, who is the acting director of the African Center for the Study of the United States, which is really the powerhouse behind this initiative, and has used its good offices to bring together these organizations, and also reached out to Mail and Guardian, which has also provided us with this platform that we are benefiting from. But let me attempt to introduce Bob Wickessa. Bob is Partnerships and Research Director or Coordinator and Acting Director at the African Center for the Study of the United States, which is based or affiliated to the University. Actually, it's based at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He's also a senior lecturer in the Department of Journalism and Media Studies, where he supervises master's and doctoral projects in international communications. He holds a doctoral degree in international communications from the Communication University of China, Beijing. His work on African diasporas includes African diaspora before and after COVID-19, which is edited. It's a collection of papers that were put together as part of this initiative, and it was published by Africa in Fact, I think. Oh, this is the earlier version, not the current version. Sorry about that. He also published The Age of Digital Diaspora Diplomacy, also by Africa in Fact, and is currently co-editing a volume on African Americans and Africans. He's well published in academic and popular platforms on the intersection of communications and diplomacy. So we have with us Bob Wickessa. We really thank you for making all this possible, and we look forward to listening to you. This is something you have been working on extensively. This is an initiative you have nurtured with all commitment and energy, and it's really a pleasure to have you. You'll be speaking both from inside and outside, and we really look forward to this. But let's look at some of the issues that are likely to come up. First of all, when you look at the history of U.S.-Africa relations over the years, over the decades, you will see that it's actually evolved a lot. But it's interesting because the United States, unlike most Western powers, does not really have a history of colonialism in Africa. And therefore, it comes to the table with kind of clean hands, so to speak. But again, when you look at the context of the Cold War, where the United States emerged as the strongest military power in the world, arguably so, you would see that its relations with Africa was also impacted upon by the Cold War. As you know, most of the African countries got independence after the Cold War, except with two exceptions, if you probably think in terms of countries like Liberia and Ethiopia. Those would be probably the only two exceptions. All the other African countries came on their own as independent sovereign states within the context of the Cold War. But then this was also the era of non-aligned movements, which also meant that African states, independent states, had a measure of agency in terms of determining what their foreign relations would be, and not necessarily tie themselves in the whole question of East-West competition. But at the same time, they were not completely insulated from those influences. There's also the question of the presence of African diasporas in the United States, which has quite a long history. And then we then go on to look at issues of trade and economic ties. We then look at issues around security. So to a large extent, we are looking at a system of changes and continuities in United States-Africa relations. But we do believe that with the new administration in the United States, there is a new opportunity to rejig, rejuvenate, and revisit some of the aspects of Africa's engagements with the United States. As you would see, while the previous administration kind of put Africa in a back burner and did have a couple of policies that would appear to have not put Africa in a place of prominence in terms of its global calculations. The new administration has made certain gestures that speak to a kind of moment of change in relations. And this moment of change means in many ways that we are in a position to begin to renegotiate and reposition Africa in relation to the United States. There is a change context. You could see that once President Biden came in place, he revoked certain policies around migration. He also made personal calls to certain African heads of state. He put up a virtual appearance at the African Union Heads of State Summit, and he's kind of provided support for human rights. It was significant and symbolic that he backed an African for the position of the leadership of the World Trade Organization, and certain issues around Africa's free continental trade area have shown that the United States is really very willing to do business with the continent. However, there are also continuities around humanitarian intervention, around issues of promotion of democracy and human rights, around issues of security cooperation. And some have argued that beyond just having good relations, we should begin to think of a partnership. And some have also argued that in the changed global context, where other emerging powers are becoming very interested in Africa and are even going to the extent of profiling alternate models of cooperation, powers like India, powers like China, powers like emerging powers like Turkey, and some of the countries of the Middle East, we are in a situation in which Africa has to be quite strategic in terms of its engagements with different powers in the world. And Africa should be very careful not to be sucked into turning itself into a chessboard for superpower games in a rapidly changing world. Of course, as we speak, we are speaking virtually. I would imagine that in a pre-COVID world, we would have been engaged on a face-to-face basis. And one of the realities that we are dealing with is a COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic may be a health issue, but as we have seen, it's also throwing up opportunities. So what opportunities would lie for US-Africa engagements in a post-pandemic world? In what ways can African countries engage the United States in terms of turning the tide on the COVID-19 pandemic? Issues around the production and distribution of vaccines, issues around vaccine equity are bound to come up in such engagements. And finally, looking at having a coherent policy framework. Who are the actors? Who are the stakeholders? How can African people and African governments come together and actually present this coherent framework with which we can engage with the United States on a co-equal basis and on a mutually beneficial basis, and begin to throw away the legacies of asymmetrical relations and begin to see how capacities within the African continent, how the rebuilding of the African middle class, how the engagement of African youth, which constitute majority of the population of the continent, with a lot of aspirations, and who have to address both issues of unemployment and issues of uncertain futures. How with this burst of energy that is really not really channeled at this point in time, how can we begin through our external engagements, particularly with the United States, begin to draw inspiration, begin to draw ideas, and begin to use our engagements to further the African story and to promote African interests. And as I said earlier, to deal with some of these issues, we have our very good experts who are lined up and ready to go. From their profiles, you'll see that a lot of them have very good engagements, well-rooted in Africa, and some of them have actually studied in China, and some of them have studied in the United States. And so we have a distinguished panel. I can even go as far as call them a galaxy of stars that will shine a lot of illumination on some of the issues I have tried to talk about. And we also have a distinguished audience who are also ready and primed to engage us. And at the end of the day, with the organizers, of course, with the cooperation of the organizers and their support, we hope that we'll make very significant inputs into beginning to shape an African policy that is coherent, that is integrated, that is reflective of the interests and aspirations of African people, to engage with the United States. And while we are doing this, we would also need to identify those channels and those individuals that can actually promote and support the cause of Africa-US relations. under this current administration and beyond. Having said this, it is my pleasure to call on our first presenter. And our first presenter is Asen Brisbado. All the speakers have 8 minutes, and my instructions are that the 8 minutes would have to be observed. So without eating into your time, Brice, it is my pleasure to ask you to share your thoughts on this this very interesting issue. So Brice, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cyril, for having me. The title of my presentation is Africa is an Opportunity, Not a Problem. Advocacy for a New Vision of Africa-US Relations. My main claim is that Joe Biden's administration should adjust the actions of the US to take into account the reality of Africa's strategic importance. It is time to recognize Africa as an opportunity and not as a problem or a burden. This implies the development of a new relations between the US and Africa based not on assistance, but on partnership. I will develop this claim for 5 short arguments. First, Africa's strategic importance now no longer needs to be demonstrated. Africa's strategic importance has varied according to the international relations of each era. By the early 1960s, the end of colonization and the independence of many African countries had increased Africa's strategic importance. In that period of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union would strive on the one hand to ally the voices of these countries in intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations, and on the other hand, to enlist them in their ideological camp. Meanwhile, former colonial powers such as France and the UK fought to retain their influence on the continent by establishing special ties with their former colonies. In the early 1990s, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, Africa lost some of its geostrategic interests as other parts of the world attracted more attention. Some of the international aid formerly provided to Africa was redirected to the former socialist countries of Eastern Europe. However, since by the late 1990s, Africa has regained strategic importance, both for security and above all economic reasons. Indeed, second, there is a need to rethink security issues to make way for human development. Indeed, the fight against terrorism has increased Africa's geopolitical importance on security issues. The US is increasingly involved in working on security challenges on the African continent, whose insecurity, terrorism, internal conflict, migration, and maritime piracy, for example, are increasingly affecting the US. The US approach to Africa today is to say that security and development are inseparable, and that the path to development must pass through the achievement of security. This securitization of development is certainly damaging for Africa, for security is used to justify the pursuit of specific development initiatives, even at the expense of other considerations such as good governance, the protection of human rights, and meeting the basic needs of vulnerable populations. Indeed, the securitization of development aid suggests that the US sees African countries not as partners, but rather as a problem or even a threat. The US no longer sees development assistance to Africa as an end in itself, but as a way for the superpower to overcome its own global security concern. The Biden administration will therefore have to rethink the security development nexus for a better collaboration with Africa. Third, there is also a need to adjust the terms of trade for African raw materials. Africa has an immense supply of natural resources. It is therefore necessary to put into perspective the discourse of the marginalization of Africa, which is based on the fact that its contribution to world trade is minimal and is valued at less than 3% of the volume of world trade according to the 2019 report of the World Trade Organization. This small percentage is mainly due to the deterioration in the terms of trade. Philippe Hugo gives an illuminating example. He says that a pair of Nike shoes, for example, we sell for 70 US dollars, cost the producer 15 US dollars, of which only 3%, only $3 go to the workers, and $16 for advertising costs in the north, and $35 in commercial margins. Without an adjustment in the terms of trade, Africa's contribution to world trade will remain marginal. This marginalization does not mean global disinterest or global quarantine. On the contrary, we can speak of a real increasing dependence of industrialized countries on Africa in terms of the supply of raw material. The call for fair trade towards Africa should be an imperative for industrialized countries such as the US. It is therefore necessary for the Biden administration to adjust trade relations with Africa so that Africa's trade in raw material can be a source of development, not impoverishment. Fourth, the need to support reform for Africa in international organizations. Although Africa has a strong presence in multilateral organizations, its capacity for influence is limited by the rules of the game of these organizations, which have often been defined by the great powers. It should be noted that by the time most African countries gained independence in the early 1960s, the Bretton Woods international financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank had already been established in 1944 and the United Nations in 1945. Africa's place is no better in subsequent organizations, as these are often power relations that tend to assign to Africa an extra role. Therefore, the Biden administration could support the reforms that African countries are asking for in major international organizations such as the UN Security Council, the Bretton Woods Institution, the World Trade Organization, etc. This is not a favor to be done to Africa, but a recognition of its right. Finally, there is a need to restore the complexity and dignity of the African continent. Indeed, Africa is often seen as a country or even a large village that is almost homogeneous throughout the continent. This semantic violence projects onto the international scene a figure of Africa without relief and devoid of any complexity, leading to undue generalization. What happened in one African country is easily generalized to all of Africa. This is the case with war, famine, poverty, pandemics, and a host of evils that suggest that Africa belongs to a world different from the rest of humanity. Thus, various aid programs are designed by so-called African specialists, and they ultimately prove to be of little benefit to Africa. It is important that the Biden administration listen more attentively to African experts in the design of programs for Africa. Thus, the Biden administration could help establish new relations with Africa by restoring its complexity. Overall, the new Biden administration is raising hopes after Donald Trump, who did not deign to visit Africa. But it is important that relations between Africa and the US become relationships of partnership and not just assistance. The US has much to receive from Africa. This is what I really believe. However, more equitable agreements are needed so that Africa and the US can discover the mutual benefits of their collaboration. So I will stop from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arsene. You have spoken to, I think I will start from the last point that engagements need to emphasize the mutual benefits that will accrue both to the United States of America as well as Africa. You've made some very important points about what African policymakers and the African policy communities should be thinking about. They should be thinking about the need to emphasize Africa's geostrategic importance in global affairs. There is a need to de-securitize development and emphasize human development in engagements. There is also the need, as you have argued, to reform trade to emphasize more equity and more access of African goods into US markets. There's also a need to support Africa's push for greater representation at the decision-making levels of international organizations, and they need to listen more to Africa's perspectives, Africa's interests, and pay attention to this. On this note, I would then go quickly to the next speaker, and it is my pleasure to invite Philani Ntembu to please give us his presentation. Philani, you have the floor.
Thank you, colleagues. I think mine really comes in quite well after the first presentation. I'll try to keep it at 10 minutes. Really where my discussion is framed, it's framed around the idea of taming expectations. So looking at the foreign policy priorities under Biden and implications for South Africa, Africa, and the world. Now, the reason I really framing it around taming expectations is that I think we all remember the level of expectations that were displayed across the African continent when former President Obama ascended into office. And, when looking at a Biden administration, many will be tempted to say, but this is a continuation of the Obama administration, and therefore the same expectations we had, we should project them onto the Biden administration. However, I think an important lesson that Africans have learned from the Obama administration is that it is important that you have to tame the type and manage the type of expectations that you have towards a US administration based on the type of challenges and constraints that the administration faces domestically, but also internationally. So the first thing is really around the importance of managing, at least for the new administration, is that it's coming in having to manage domestic and international expectations after the Trump administration. So whether we are talking about internal cohesion, an increasingly polarized political landscape within the United States, issues flaring up around issues of civil rights, issues around the relationship between the police and African Americans. So all these issues, they impose a set of constraints to the current administration, especially when we take into account that these issues have to some extent been exacerbated or elevated by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which means that the Biden administration has to, whether it likes it or not, it has to spend a considerable amount of its time essentially trying to rebuild national cohesion and trying to manage domestic expectations. It is also coming into office at a time where people will be contrasting Biden with the previous Trump administration. And in drawing that contrast, it will basically have to, it's sort of this idea of America is back. But the question is, what type of a world is America coming back into? It is coming back into a world where its transatlantic strategic partners in Europe are increasingly speaking about the concept of strategic autonomy. It is coming back into a world that essentially had planned in a US administration, a previous administration, that was increasingly withdrawing from multilateral institutions like the World Health Organization, WTO, the Paris Agreement. So it's coming back into a world that is vastly different. So the idea that the US will simply slot back in and follow on from where it left off is not realistic. So essentially, the Biden administration is faced with a very real challenge of managing those domestic expectations, but also of managing those international expectations. And therefore, as Africans, as we think about our strategy or our strategies towards the Biden administration, we have to factor those very real constraints that the administration faces. Some of the foreign policy effects, for instance, of the Trump administration's decisions are having far-reaching effects that are proving even difficult for the current administration to simply wish away or to reverse. Some of those, for instance, include the very sort of aggressive trade wars with China and the European allies. Well, we found that obviously, whilst the administration will try to reverse some of those policies, it's very difficult for the administration to reverse them wholeheartedly or wholesale reversals. Because, for instance, on China, it's one of the issues in the US currently where you have bipartisan agreement. It's one of the areas where even amongst perception studies amongst civil society and just the general population in the US, people increasingly in the US have a distrust of China or see it as a competitor or as the US's key competitor. Now that forces the Biden administration to continue to take a hard position to not appear to be soft when it comes to China. But it's also meant that the European allies are increasingly speaking about the issue of strategic autonomy. Some of the decisions the Trump administration took were such as moving the US embassy to Jerusalem and recognition of Israeli settlements in Palestine, and also on questions such as Morocco and Western Sahara. There's also the negotiations that were underway with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam project. Now, all of those sets of decisions that were taken are proving more difficult to simply reverse. And therefore, these are the type of things that we need to understand, that some of the decisions that have been taken by the previous administration act as a key constraint on how this administration will move. And with that in mind, it will be important for African stakeholders in taming their expectations to limit the set of key areas that they want to engage with the Biden administration, especially in the foreign policy space. So when thinking about those key areas that African stakeholders could be trying to zone in on, we could focus on three specific areas. The first one is on economic development. And here, when thinking about economic development, it's going to be quite important that African stakeholders actually initiate the discussions on the African Growth and Opportunity Act. It is coming to an end in 2025, I think, and therefore it will be important for African stakeholders to not wait necessarily for the US trade representative to, to come up with a new set of criteria or with a way forward. But taking into account that African stakeholders have already moved ahead with issues such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, we're going to have to discuss with the current administration already what the direction of the US is when it comes to global trade, especially when it comes to trade with Africa, what the thinking is with regards AGOA, but also more importantly, what the thinking is in a post-AGOA landscape. Now, it's likely to be that, yes, AGOA, if it's renewed after 2025, but it will have to be factoring in the current dynamics on the continent, which are related to the continental free trade area. So these are some of the issues we need to be engaging the current administration on. And it doesn't have to be at the highest levels, all the times, but it has to be, speaking with counterparts in the US, activating the various networks that are there, both within the state and outside of the state, because it will be important to understand what is the direction of the current Biden administration when it comes to trade. Equally, when thinking about trade, we need to also be thinking about issues like development assistance and aid, and therefore thinking about US aid and how US aid can be used as a catalyst for Africa's economic development. So this is going to be important in a sense that you don't want to have this phenomenon where you give on the one side through aid, and then you take on the other side through unfair trade practices. So we need to be reconciling those two, ensuring that US aid remains committed, ensuring that US aid remains committed to the most vulnerable countries, but also that they do not take their eyes off the ball in terms of the reality that much of global poverty in this day and age is taking place also in middle income countries. So, there needs to be a balanced approach there. The second is on regional integration. African stakeholders, because of the Continental Free Trade Area, because of Agenda 2063, and a whole range of policies amongst the sub-regional economic communities, it will be important for African stakeholders to essentially work with the US on a regional integration and ensuring that the US acts as a catalyst and a supporter of Africa's regional integration aspirations. Lastly, on the issue of geopolitics, it will be important that African stakeholders ensure that they do not become caught up in the midst of giants fighting. So we don't want to be forced into a situation where Africans are pressured to choose between the US or China. The reality is that African stakeholders do not have that luxury. They have to work with the stakeholders that are there and that are willing to work with them. However, what the US should focus on is a much more positive approach in terms of what it is bringing onto the African landscape, rather than being blinded by a focus on its competitor in the form of China. So Africa will have to be at the forefront of managing those geopolitical tensions between the US and China and ensuring that they do not inhibit Africa's own development priorities. And thank you, colleagues. I'll end it there.
Thank you very much, Filani, for bringing us back to reality by asking for a more realistic approach, and one based on taming of expectations by drawing attention to the constraints in which foreign policy making is being undertaken in the United States. serious domestic challenges, and of course, balancing this with the changes in the world that America is returning to in terms of its foreign policy. I think you have helped by saying that taming expectations will mean zeroing in on three things. And the three things you mentioned have to do with economic development, focusing on trade, of course, the need for Africa to have a coherent policy or agenda for what happens after AGOA runs out, and a forward-looking strategy for engaging various levels of American policymakers on this. The other thing that you mentioned that I noted was the whole question of regional integration, looking for ways in which African policymakers and policy communities can actually get some American support to help deepen the ongoing regional integration projects that are taking place around the continent. And lastly, geopolitics, a note of caution that Africa would defend its autonomy and try not to be sucked into superpower games in which the country begins to become captive to a new Cold War between global powers, whether they are established or whether they are emerging. I think more about this will come up during our question and answer session. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Amini Kajunju to please make her presentation. You are muted. Or mute.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Filani mentioned economic development as one of the important pillars of the relationship between the United States and Africa. And I think I will sort of piggyback on that as I speak about education, entrepreneurship, and employment. And how do we turn the youth bulge into a youth dividend in Africa, and the policies and visions to consider. One of the things that I believe that makes America an important player on the global stage. I mean, most people think about certainly its economic power and its military power. But when I zero in on, sort of the three things that Africa and America can truly partner on as we churn the youth bulge into a youth dividend, I think of the depth and breadth of the US private sector. I think about the existence of businesses of all sizes, and I think about the ease of creating a company in the United States and some of the best practices of encouraging and facilitating entrepreneurship. It is not without its problems, but I think the underlining framework that America uses attracts people from all over the world to build businesses here. And then that brings in those jobs, which are critical to the issues that we're having on the continent with our youth. And then underpinning all of that is a higher education system that, again, has its issues, but it is the envy of the world as well. People from all over the world seek to come to the United States to take advantage of the R&D that occurs here, the liberal arts orientation, the existence of technical and vocational schools, plus the research institutions. And even when you think about the community colleges and the four-year colleges, and the depth and breadth of the higher education system in America is quite impressive. And so what does this have to do with the youth of Africa and our relationship with the African continent? I think a lot. We have some things that I think we can work together on, and they require partnership and being able to draw from what is best in the United States and what is best in Africa, and then bringing them together so that we can improve the lot of our young people on the continent. I read a statistic recently that broke my heart, even though I think we all know this intuitively. But it said 76% of college graduates on the African continent would leave the continent if they could. That's a sobering statistic for me, and it tells me that there are some major policy failures that would make our young people want to leave the continent, even those with college degrees. That's the thing that sort of struck me. Even those with college degrees would want to leave the continent if they could in the next 5 years. So that tells me that we're not doing enough on the continent to create those jobs, to create those opportunities for entrepreneurship, to create an educational system that helps our young people say, there's a lot that I can contribute to this continent, and I have the environment to do that. As we are thinking about and working through this pandemic, and in particular vaccine distribution, I am struck by the following statistic, that only 1% of global investment in R&D is spent in Africa, and that the African continent has 0.1% of the world's patents. Currently, the African continent needs about 1 million new PhD and researchers to catch up with the world. So as I think about, the public health issues that this pandemic has brought up, and the research and the development that is required, and the fact that we must have Africans around the table to discuss not only distribution, but the making of these vaccines. And we need technical expertise for this, and we need an educational system that produces the types of individual that can sit at that table advocating for the needs of African people. So again, I'm struck by how the United States and Africa, in creating policies that look at education, employment, and opportunities, how we can work together with that. IUGB is actually an interesting example of that partnership that could be possible. IUGB was created out of a partnership of Georgia State University and University of and the government of Côte d'Ivoire. And so underpinning IUGB are operational and administrative framework that came from Georgia State University, but that is rooted in its Africanness and adapted to the Ivorian reality and the West African reality, and obviously the African reality. So these are the types of partnerships that could be developed. But we must go beyond what was done with IUGB. IUGB currently has 850 students. We're serving those 850 students, and that's important. But clearly, we have about 250 million children and youth that must go to school. So we're literally a drop in a bucket. How can we create an educational system that reaches the millions of young people that need to be educated? And then how can we turn around and create an environment where jobs are created? One of the statistics that the African Development Bank has says that out of 12 million students that come out of African schools, only 3 million jobs. So one of the things, only 3 million jobs are created for those 12 million. So it doesn't even matter how well you are educated and how well you've done at school and how well you're prepared for the world of work. When you come out of school, you will not find a job. And so therefore, we must create entrepreneurs, and we must create those opportunities for those investments, both local and international, so that we can have that economic development that was discussed by the previous speaker. I'll end my comments by saying that one of my favorite definition of what education is our education must be defined by the problems that we seek to solve. So as we embark on the importance of these 3 E's, like I like to call them, education, entrepreneurship, and employment, and as we embark on African nations really taking these 3 issues very seriously, because we can do a lot of other things, but if we're not employing our young, if we're not educating them, if we're not creating environments for them to be entrepreneurs, then we will have potential mayhem and destruction that will undermine any advancement that we might have in other parts of the economy. So this is actually quite critical. No country becomes a high income country without these three factors: a strong educational system, and employment, full employment, and entrepreneurs. So as America and Africa seek to work together, I'm hoping that these three issues will be at the core of those potential partnerships, and that as Africans, as we seek to educate our young, that we define our education by the problems that we seek to solve. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amini, for approaching this from a very important perspective. You've spoken about the three E's, and we are looking at how Africa can engage the United States in order to emphasize and strengthen and catalyze the three E's. And the three E's will be education, entrepreneurship, and employment. And you're targeting the youth, but I would also say that part of this would also be the African middle class, which has suffered immensely right from the 1980s during the structural adjustment years, and is yet to fully recover. I think that we will definitely come back to this, looking at education and looking at the statistics that you brought to the table. This is really very important, that if Africa is to leapfrog in developmental terms, it has to pay attention to the three E's. And for this to happen, you are putting on the table an agenda for engagement along the lines of the three E's, based on the kind of resources, the kind of expertise, and the kind of facilities that and opportunities that can be created through engaging US on this very important issue. But I will save time. We have a lot of time to discuss this further. Thank you once again, and it is my pleasure to invite the next speaker, and that will be Bob Wickessa. You are muted, or mute.
How we often forget about muting and being muted and being and then having to unmute. But thanks, moderator, for ably moderating the session, and thanks for the opportunity. Mine will be an intervention that I hope will end at the 8th minute, and it is just looking at why it is we need an African policy towards the US, and some of the pathways towards moving in that direction of creating an African policy framework towards the US. And I think I'll start by just looking at developments in the recent times. The discussions around Africa-US from a policy framework kind of took an upward trajectory last year as we went towards the US elections, an election that was dramatic in more respects than one, and one that, in fact, the drama, spilled over into the new year, even as the former president, Donald Trump, attempted not really to leave power, with many African commentators mentioning that he seemed quite African in those respects. But what struck me at the point in time was just the amount of interest that was generated through the whole saga on the African continent. Half the time I found myself doing Google searches on just how much was being written on about those elections from an African perspective. And I think we did read and hear a lot about why the US elections 2020 matter for Africa. What are the implications? How will they influence the relations and so forth? So I think this did create what the moderator, Dr. Obi, mentioned at the beginning as a moment in time that provided an opportunity for actually Africans to reflect very keenly on what it means and how they should relate with the US as a global power, as a nation that they have looked up to. Because at that point in time, in fact, there was talk of the US can learn from Africa, in fact. And this is what really speaks to the moment in time. kind of symbolism and, kind of consideration. We are now going towards the first anniversary since that tumultuous and fractious period. I think those of us who follow these relations will look back to August, September, October, November 2020 and remember all the drama that we're being, exposed to. And at that point in time, I think many of us of African descent or interested in Africa were saying, no, look, this is actually a great opportunity for us to put together a framework. So as we go into a year into the new administration, I think the point we need to be reflecting on is where are we in terms of just putting together a framework, even if it's a discussion paper, that can get us starting to say this is how we relate with the US on matters economics, matters culture, matters politics and democracy and so forth. And in fact, at the same time, if you look at the narrative, there's the other side of the coin, which we might be interested in, but not quite if we are really thinking of an African starting point, of African agency for that matter, which is that the US not really come up with an African policy up to this point in time. That would be of interest to us, but I think that is spinning the coin a bit. Whereas we'll be interested in a US policy towards Africa, there have been just so very many policies from the US towards Africa. To an extent, they have been codified. In fact, we have talked of continuities because there is a sense in which there's unwritten policies, US towards Africa, for example, by partisanship over things like AGOA and so forth. I think what is really lacking is an African engagement framework, which is why that should be what focuses us as Africans. And so that being like a rallying call, a call to arms, if you wish, something that we think we can seize as a moment in time. One then asks, how do you go about it? And there are various ways in which one can go about it. One is that there's always the question of, should an African policy frameworks to the US be at the national level, at the regional economic level, like the regions on the 5 regions of the continent, including diaspora, if you wish, or should it be at the national level, or should it be at the continental level? And I think my sense is that one doesn't preclude the other. We should be having Zimbabwean policy towards the US. They should generate a policy in Zimbabwe, as they should in Cote d'Ivoire, in Sierra Leone, in Mozambique, in Botswana, everywhere. But at the same time, we could have a Southern African Development Community framework towards the US, an East African Community framework, an IGAD framework, an ECOWAS framework, a Central African framework, an Arab Northern Africa Maghreb region framework. And then we can still have an African policy framework that is continental, that borrows heavily from Agenda 2063, that incorporates Agenda 2030, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as they relate to Africa and the US. So I don't think the argument that Africans never come together to agree on anything and therefore there's no way we're going to have a policy framework holds water. I think we've seen over the years from Abuja in 1991 to Durban in 2002 that even though we have not done as well as we ought to have, we still have the African Union. It is limping, but it's there and it provides a framework. In fact, we should be thinking of how to strengthen it. And so I think that's one of my considerations, that we could have multiple frameworks towards the US at the various levels, but they all cohere or are all coherent at a continental level. And therefore, then we can go to the Biden administration and say, look, as far as trade is concerned, we are guided by the African Continental Free Trade Area. As far as matters environment are concerned, we are guided by the United Nations Climate Change Paris Agreement or something to that effect. But you need to have that framework at a continental level, a country level, and at a regional economic community level. And in fact, we have so much material to work on, in addition to just analysis of the situations on the continent as they are and as they relate to the US. I lose count of the African continental positions, positions on peace and security, on economics, on culture, even on media, the Windhoek Declaration, for example, on matters to do with media and communication. And so it's not as if we lack the material that will go into these policy frameworks, but we just need to be strategic in how we go about them. So having said that, in terms of the possibility of frameworks at all levels, one then want to look at the issues that will go into the frameworks. And I think I've alluded to that we have now just come up with, for example, the African Continental Free Trade Area. That should be the framework that guides our engagement with the US in terms of negotiating with what, for example, my colleague Pilani was talking about, the African continent, the renegotiating AGOA, or discussing Prosper Africa, or how we actually deal or engage with things to do with, for example, the Millennium Cooperation, which is a key artery of US engagement with us as Africans. And that then will actually apply across climate change. We have a good framework that is UN-based that we can leverage, we can adopt here. I think very lastly, knowing that my time is running out, is who does the framework, therefore? And that is also a very loaded question. It might be assumed that policymakers, meaning people in government, positions, particularly those in foreign policy offices, but also those in other departments in African countries or in African organizations, including the AU, will be the ones to do it. But I think that will be a mistake. I think one cannot exclude African civil society in this engagement. And civil society writ large will include think tanks, those who are actually in activism, but those who are also in universities, advocating for certain position and so forth. And that we should actually be involved, because in some instances, in fact, an African policy towards the US will be critical of some certain leaders that are undemocratic, for example. So you need the involvement of everybody. So at least the generation and the basic framework has to include everybody. But then obviously we do understand that when it comes to negotiation and selling it and so forth, there's no way you're going to avoid governments, because essentially then it takes a governmental, bilateral, or multilateral form. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob Wickessa. I think you've raised a very fundamental question, and you've also provided answers, which is equally interesting. I think the fundamental question you raised is, where are we in terms of putting together a framework for engaging with the United States? And you've provided an answer by saying that we have bits and pieces here and there, and that we can also come to this question from different levels, and that one level, be it national or sub-regional, should not, or regional, should not preclude the other, but that at the end of the day, there has to be a continental response that draws upon all those things. And you alluded to the Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030, and you spoke to trade. But I think the fundamental issue is that you also made a case that this should not be the exclusive preserve of the official decision makers, that civil society has a key role to play. And you drew our attention to some of the critical aspects that the current moment in US-Africa relations portends for African people. And I think the point about the role of civil society, particularly the role of think tanks, researchers, activists, and just citizens, it's really very important. But to save time, and because there'll be more time to discuss this later, it is my pleasure to invite our last presenter, and that will be in the person of Charles Prente. Charles Prente, you have the floor
now. Thank you so much, Dr. Obi. I'm so grateful for this opportunity. Indeed, my paper, or my short article, is already out, so I'll rather highlight some critical areas that I think we can engage in a form of question, answers, and then comments. Now, my The title of my paper or presentation is African Agency, Human Rights and Issues of Homosexuality, Biden and Africa. Indeed, for the past 10 or so years, we've had many materials on the issue of homosexuality. The materials that we have tend to look at the issues of whether it is foreign to Africa or native and things of that sort. And there are questions that are raised about issues of right. Is it a matter of individual right for the spirit of the libertarians, or for example, John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, and others? Or it's a matter of an imagined collective right, which is expected to supersede the right of individuals. However we look at it, there's also the question of whether Africa is sovereign in terms of managing its own internal social, political, and human rights issues. But however we look at it, the aim of my presentation is to, bring us to look at the fact that the issue is complex, and we need to move away from providing simplistic responses. Because once we provide simplistic responses to complex issue, we end up just scratching the surface and not getting to the root or the gravamen of the matters in order to provide coherent and more or less relatively enduring responses. So I begin by saying that the homosexual debate is quite complex. And it is not just complex, it is a moral dilemma. In a sense that it is not a matter of a choice between good and bad, but rather between good and bad, depending on whose perspective you are speaking. Again, it is not just a matter of foreigners trying to impose something on Africans, because we have Africans who are also either advocates of the practice or against the practice. So that is one. And then there's a question of, I've phrased that already, whether it is foreign or native in terms of the cultural practices associated with homosexuality. Now, either way, and however we respond to it, there's a question of social exclusion. And that makes it even more complex. Because if you accept that homosexuals should have equal right like everyone else in Africa, some people will feel excluded socially. On the other hand, if you should pass a law that discriminates against homosexuals, it equally leads to social exclusion. Either way, social exclusion is difficult for everyone. And it is both un-African and also inhuman, regardless of whichever perspective we look at it. But the question for me is, why this dilemma? And why are we struggling to respond in a very coherent manner? The first is that it is an adaptive issue, or if you like, moral issue, and not a technical one. Now, if it were a technical issue, we would have resolved it easily. So, for example, if someone had cancer and the doctor knew that chemotherapy will work, just offer. But then imagine the cancer patient has a passion and pleasure for smoking, which in itself is the reason for the cancer. How do you convince the person to give up the practice of smoking? So at this point, it goes beyond a technical issue of medication to a complex issue of changing perspective, worldview, and more so pleasure, because the person has to choose between two contesting pleasures. One pleasure, the pleasure to smoke, and the pleasure to live. And making that choice is always difficult. And for me, that is the way the homosexual discourse appears, because it is highly subjective in terms of sexual preferences. So someone would say, well, I prefer to marry a biological woman because I'm a biological man. Another person would say, well, I prefer to marry somebody of the same sex. And both ways, there's a question of instinct or genetic or genetic straitjacketing So that makes it difficult. How do you resolve such an issue? So if we are to go beyond the technicalities of biologies, then we go into issues of morality. But of course, issues of morality is equally subjective. So that makes it complex, a complex issue. The second one that makes the homosexual debate complex is the notion of time as linear. Historically, many cultures until Judeo-Christian tradition had looked at time as cyclical. Now, this unfortunately created a certain impression that some non-Western cultures that had the notions of cyclical recognition of time as anti-progress or lacking the idea of future. So Mbiti was one of the earliest scholars to have averred that Africans lack futurism because the African reckoning of time is cyclical. But this is a very technical and also difficult issue, which, as I said, adds to the complexity of the homosexual debate. Because when we see time as one of linearity, then we bring in the social construction of time, which implies that we should move from simplicity of culture to complexity of culture, known as civilization, however we define civilization. And with this kind of constriction in the construction of time as linear progression from simple to complex in cultural orientation, the past is constructed as tradition, and the present is constructed as modern. The past, being tradition, is seen as communalistic based, and then the present is seen as individualistic based because it frees the spirit of the individual. The past is seen as retrogressive, and the present is seen as progressive. So when we look at the homosexual debate, each side, both for and against, engage this kind of binary. So those who are in support of it say, well, you should be progressive. In other words, you are a cake if you don't accept it. Now, those who are against it will say, well, we are against it because we belong to a particular cultural tradition that must be kept. Either way, it brings out another layer of complexity. So, what are the implications of this dilemma? First, it creates a narrative of false binaries, which is to say that it is either human beings live in the past and reject the things of modernity, or live in the modern world, the present, and reject the things of the past. So if you read many of the books, those who support the past say, we are progressive. In other words, we are modern. And those who are against it are seen as traditionalist, conservative, and neo-traditionalist. But that, as I said, is a false binary because human beings live across time and even into the future while in the present. So, for example, we've had homosexuality in the histories of the world all the way back, perhaps to the beginning of humanity. So, Greco-Roman Empire had homosexuals, and it was all over the place. It was quite pervasive, at least from the literature. And yet, in Western civilization, for the purposes and influence of Judeo-Christian values and sex ethics, it was suppressed to the point that in England in the 16th century, it was considered foreign and sinful. However, after the 1960s, which was an important watershed in another form of secularization known as secularization of morality, what it meant was that homosexual practices has now been accepted. So we see the West also going back to their past to bring to the present and they frame it as modern. So last but two issues are raised. I know my time is almost up. The question of the modern state in Africa and the issue of homosexuality or homosexual rights. How was the modern state in Africa constructed in relation to the law or so-called homophobic laws? The point is, homophobic laws, as they are today called, was an imposition on Africans. As far as my reading affords me, it was first passed in India in the 1860s and brought to the continent of Africa and elsewhere in the empiredom of colonial powers. Now, because colonialism itself was built on violence, it was imposed, the law was imposed on Africa in the name of religion. Today, and I'm ending, Africa is deeply religious, to the point that the very tool that was used to impose the practice, which is religion, has become deeply concretized in Africa, to the point that many think Africa is now the seatbelt of Christianity and Islam. And these religions tend to be hostile to homosexual practices. So what is the way forward? In terms of the way forward, there's a question of sovereignty. And I would say that sovereignty is a myth because it assumes what is today known as self-sufficient, self-esteem, and all that, which is not true. But instead, nations need to have what I would call multiple narratives. And this would imply the application of wisdom, tact, and dialogue to engage the complexity of the homosexual debate. So I will end here and take comments as they come. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Charles Prente, for giving us food for thought in terms of African agency, human rights, and focusing, zeroing in on the question of homosexuality. And it's very interesting to hear how you've given a historical background and put this in context of the need for really gradualism rather than imposition, and trying to respect the boundaries of this issue, and also looking at approaching it through dialogue and tact rather than trying to ram things through. I think you have raised some very important issues, and I have no doubt that this will come up in the course of our discussions. I just want to let the audience know again that the presentations that you have listened to this morning are really driven and derived from a publication, in case you have not seen this, by Good Governance Africa. And the publication is Africa in Fact, issue 58, July to September 2021. I would also ask you to take a look at this AIF issue, and you would really appreciate the kind of depth and substance that has gone into these presentations this morning. At this point, it's my duty to then begin to ask members of our distinguished audience to pose questions to the speakers. I already have two questions which I am going to throw up. One is by Stevens Magalapa. And the question is this: what is the posture of the US in using public diplomacy to communicate its foreign policy to Africa in relation to ACFTA and AGOA? And the second question has been sent in by Vuyiswa Nkada. How will US help African countries combat security issues such as terrorism when they can't even help allies in the Middle East? These are two questions. Any member of our distinguished panel can take up these questions. And as we get more questions, I will pose them to you. Thank you very much. So who wants to take up the first question? Bob, please.
Okay, let me take the first question on public diplomacy and related issues of soft power with regards to the African Continental Free Trade Area and AGOA. I think for years, the US has framed its involvement with Africa since 2000. In fact, the Bush administration is the one that set off this journey on the African Growth and Opportunity Act. The public, if we consider public diplomacy, if we defined it as an attempt by one country to influence publics in another country, which is a definition indeed, or we approach it from the soft power perspective, which is that a country tries to win the favorability or to get some very good, to score good points in another country by doing good, through its culture, institutions, and so forth, rather than using hard power. Then indeed, the AGOA has been one of those instruments that the US has used, because it has always had bipartisan approval across the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It is seen as a great help to Africa. And in literature, no American leader or president actually fails to mention AGOA as a signature project of the US. However, I think that narrative is beginning to wear thin. It's beginning to look threadbare, if you wish. Since 2000, particularly as my colleague Pilani here, knows this narrative quite a bit. China came in and said, no, look, you can have AGOA, but we also have very vibrant, we'll give you 60 billion US dollars every so often, every 3 years, to put together ports, roads and so forth, which just actually put the US in a shadow, as it were, because, in fact, there's been a critique that AGOA hasn't quite worked well, which is why there's always the clamor. So the public diplomacy perspective does not square with what the public good, the favorability that has come in. Now, I think very quickly, so that my other colleagues can also have a chance. Once we had the African Continental Free Trade Area come on board, I think what we have seen is, for example, the US trade representative coming very quickly to say, can we now reach an agreement with you very fast for a free trade area, in fact, because we think AGOA might not be necessarily the best framework, that it's better perhaps to negotiate with an FTA with the entire continent and so forth. And while that is good, it just takes us back to the need for Africans to take initiative in their hands, because the African Continental Free Trade Area is yours. So don't just let it be negotiated elsewhere. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bob. I'm looking at the time, and we just have 4 minutes within which we need to round up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the remaining questions and ask each of our speakers to respond in 1 minute each. And here goes the questions. Filani's point on US versus China's work in Africa is important. One important distinction is each country's approach towards governance, corruption, and the social and environmental impacts of projects in Africa. This question is by Josh Habib. The second is by Susanna Caputi. African countries must join forces to stop illegal financial flows, and US must cooperate to stop this illegal flow through policy and financial intelligence. Africa wouldn't need financial assistance. And from Catherine Egbe, what role should AU play in helping Africa to have a basic policy template for how the continent relates with all countries outside the continent? And the last one is from Mohini Apaku. Who is Africa's policy towards the US shaped? It says, what is Africa's policy towards the US shaped owing to, okay, I'll just rephrase that. To what extent is Africa's policy towards the US shaped owing to the power relations? Question from Ohini again. In terms of soft power, how do you view US soft power on values in Africa and China's soft power on economic diplomacy? 1 minute each. Well, I think we should start with Amini.
Okay.
1 minute.
Yeah. For me, all of these questions are very good, and I think they hit some very key issues. But as always, at the core of solving, whether it's the illicit financial outflows, whether it's the relationship with China, whether it's the relationship with the United States, the African policymakers have to have a vision for what they want, for the Africa that they want to see, and implement that. And I think that to me, it seems to be what's always been missing. And the evidence shows that we're either oftentimes we don't have a vision, or the vision isn't inclusive enough, or and therefore we are susceptible to whatever it is that the outside player wants to do with us, because we're not rooted in executing the Africa that we want.
Thank you very much, Charles.
Yes.
1 minute.
So, I mean, these are always excellent questions, but my straightforward response would be that Africa needs to change its narratives in terms of how it engages external powers. Now, for a very long time, we've positioned ourselves in a narrative of victimhood culture where we think we are so vulnerable. And once you psychologically program yourself as vulnerable, what it means is that you are susceptible to manipulations. So for me, Africans need a certain narrative, a narrative that reinforces the significance of agency, so that even if you don't have what it takes in terms of the material or technical prosperity of the West, at least define yourself in a way that will reflect your ability to bargain with the international community. For me, that is very critical.
Thank you very much. Very well put. Next is Asim Brice Badu. 1 minute. A minute.
So, thank you very much. I think that for me, Africans should really regain their own agency. This is very important by trying to reframe the relationship that they have with some multinational or other leaders. I think that we need really a generation that think that African can resolve their own problem. When we will have this mindset, we'll be able to redraw. All these agreements will be able to shape the organizations and the state so that we can have a better result. Thank you.
Thank you. Filani, and then after that, Bob, you will have the last word. So Filani, please, 1 minute.
Excellent. Thank you. I think the key thing here is agency. I think one of the questions, African agency, one of the questions makes a good point about sort of this distinguishing point around how each country tackles, issues of corruption, governance, social, environmental impact of projects. I think what's important there is that we should avoid making these issues as though they are Western or Eastern policies. The issue of governance is squarely an issue that Africans are raising, and Africans want improved systems of governance. That is Africans' own agency that is pushing for that. So in a sense, what the US and other actors need to be doing is actually working with African countries in building the effectiveness of their own institutions to ensure that their institutions are empowered to do what they were actually structured to do. Lastly, the point that Susanna makes, I think fortunately, we have an administration in the White House which I think is more attentive to issues of illicit financial flows and so forth. So we need to work with them to actually tackle those things, because we know that Africa is actually a net exporter of finance rather than a recipient of finance, but obviously through illicit means. So we need to reverse that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see a consensus building up about African agency and the need to have the African narrative well focused and strategically constructed. And now, Bob, you have the last word.
No, I think my colleagues that have spoken before me have raised one single point, which moderator you also pointed at, which is that we need to be confident, we need to be results oriented, we have to be visionary. We shouldn't, go with victimhood and so forth. So for me, it is how do we go towards that? How do we go towards being confident in the world? Just like, in fact, I can't help it but think of the Chinese in the late 70s when they had been hammered by the Cultural Revolution, but then bouncing back in a big way because of their confidence. So in my sense, we need this policy framework. So I think the moderator, if you don't give us the policy framework today, we will blame you. Thank you.
And on that very, very humorous and happy note, I want to thank our distinguished panel of speakers. You have not disappointed. I also want to thank our distinguished audience for the questions that you've asked. I wish there could have been more time, but as always, time catches up with everybody. We have had robust, incisive, and very constructive exchanges here. And I hope that this will continue even beyond this this webinar. I want to thank our organizers, the Africa Center for the Study of United States, Wits University, IGD, and the SSRC. And I want to thank everyone that has taken time off their busy schedules to be part of this discussion. I have been asked to present to make sure that this coherent policy framework takes place. But I'm happy to announce that with your collaboration, with your cooperation and continued support, we will definitely collectively, not just me alone, collectively be able to work towards having a coherent African policy framework for engaging the United States. And on that note, I thank you once more, and I wish you a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you are. Thank you and bye.